My grandpa's will had one bizarre condition to get the inheritance. My name is Ethan, and I was 25 years old when my world got turned upside down. It wasn't in a bad way, not at first. It was one of those crisp autumn afternoons where the sun filters through the leaves in just the right way, making everything feel golden and a little bit nostalgic. That was the mood inside the old mahogany-paneled office of Henderson & Sons, attorneys at law. The air smelled of old paper and leather, a scent I'd always associate with my grandpa, Arthur. He'd passed away 2 weeks prior, a quiet, peaceful end after a long and vibrant life. Now his closest family, my dad, my aunt, and me, were gathered to hear the reading of the will. I wasn't expecting much, maybe a few $1,000s, a keepsake or two. Grandpa was comfortable, but he wasn't what you'd call rich, or so I thought. Mr. Henderson, a man whose face seemed to be carved from the same wood as his desk, cleared his throat. He adjusted his spectacles and began reading in a dry, monotone voice that did little to capture the spirit of the man we were there to remember. The first parts of the will were exactly what I'd anticipated. My aunt got his collection of vintage watches, a passion she'd shared with him. My dad received the classic car Grandpa had spent years restoring, a project they had worked on side by side in the garage. Then Mr. Henderson got to a new section, and his tone shifted almost imperceptibly. He looked directly at me over the top of his papers. The lawyer began to detail the bulk of the estate. It wasn't just a comfortable sum, it was a fortune. A multi-million-dollar portfolio of stocks, bonds, and real estate holdings. The main property, a sprawling estate in the countryside that had been in our family for generations, was also included. My jaw must have been on the floor. I looked at my dad, whose expression was a mirror of my own shock. We had no idea. Grandpa had lived modestly, driving an old sedan and wearing the same flannel shirts until they were threadbare. He was a man of simple pleasures, or so we believed. The lawyer continued, explaining that this entire staggering inheritance was to be left to me, and me alone. The reason for this, he explained, was that I was the only one who could fulfill the final and most unusual condition of the will. Mr. Henderson paused, letting the weight of the words hang in the air. The condition, he read, was that I must first locate a man named Silas Blackwood. I'd never heard the name. None of us had. The will stated that Silas Blackwood was the man responsible for the downfall of my grandpa's original business venture decades ago, a failure that had, according to the will, haunted him for the rest of his life. The condition was not for revenge or for retribution, it was something far stranger. In order to receive my inheritance, I had to find this Silas Blackwood, look him in the eye, and deliver a sincere, heartfelt apology on behalf of my grandfather. The room was silent. An apology to the man who ruined him? It made no sense. My dad started to object, his voice a low rumble of confusion, but Mr. Henderson held up a hand. The will was ironclad. He then slid a small worn object across the desk. It was an old leather-bound address book, its pages yellowed with age. The lawyer explained that this was the only clue my grandfather had left. Inside, somewhere, was the key to finding Silas Blackwood. My journey, it seemed, had just begun. I picked up the address book, its cool, smooth leather a strange comfort in my trembling hand, and wondered what on earth I had gotten myself into. I left the lawyer's office in a daze, the weight of the address book feeling heavier than a suitcase full of gold. The crisp autumn air did little to clear my head. Millions of dollars were on the line, but they were tethered to a ghost, a man named Silas Blackwood, who existed only as a villain in a story I'd never even heard. My family was just as baffled as I was. My dad drove us home in silence, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, occasionally shaking his head as if to dislodge the absurdity of it all. That evening, we sat around the kitchen table, the address book lying between us like a puzzle box from a bygone era. My grandpa, the man who taught me how to skip stones and told the worst jokes known to man, had a secret, a big one. The next day, I began my investigation. I started with the obvious. I turned to the B section of the address book, my fingers tracing the elegant faded script. There it was. Blackwood, Silas. Next to it was an address in a city a few states away, and a phone number with an old-fashioned exchange. My heart leaped. This was it. This would be easy. I pulled out my laptop, my fingers flying across the keyboard. I entered the address into a mapping service. The result was a vacant lot. A satellite view showed a patch of weeds and rubble where a building once stood. The business, according to public records, had been demolished over 20 years ago. Okay, a dead end. I tried the phone number. It was disconnected, of course. I felt a flicker of frustration. This was going to be harder than I thought. For the next week, I dove down a rabbit hole of online searches. I looked up Silas Blackwood, along with my grandpa's name, Arthur. I found old newspaper articles about my grandpa's company, a successful manufacturing firm that had gone spectacularly bankrupt in the late 1970s. The articles were vague, citing market downturns and poor management. There was no mention of a Silas Blackwood, no scandal, no public blame game. It was all very corporate and very sterile. I searched genealogy sites, social security death indexes, and even tried a few of those people finder websites that always seem to promise the world. Nothing. It was as if Silas Blackwood had vanished off the face of the earth after my grandpa's business failed. He was a phantom. I was starting to lose hope. Maybe this was my grandpa's final strange joke, a posthumous wild goose chase. But the thought of that millions-dollar inheritance and the mystery of it all kept me going. One night, I was staring at the address book again, not just looking for the name, but really looking at the page. I noticed something I'd missed before. Next to Silas Blackwood's name and the crossed-out address, there was a series of tiny, almost illegible numbers and a single word scribbled in the margin. The numbers looked like a date, 10/22/1978. I quickly cross-referenced it with the articles I'd found. It was the exact date the bankruptcy was finalized. The word, written in a shaky hand that was different from the rest of the entries, was Oakhaven. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a name and address. It was a date and a place, a significant date, a place I'd never heard of. I grabbed my laptop, my heart pounding in my chest, and typed Oakhaven into the search bar. It was a small, isolated coastal town, a 5-hour drive away. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that my journey was far from over. It was just getting started. The decision to go to Oakhaven felt impulsive, a leap of faith in a bizarre treasure map left by a dead man. I packed a small bag, told my dad I was taking a road trip to clear my head, and pointed my car towards the coast. The 5-hour drive was a blur of highways and backroads, my mind a whirlwind of questions. Who was Silas Blackwood? What happened on that October day in 1978? And why, of all places, Oakhaven? The town, when I finally arrived, felt like a place forgotten by time. It was a small, windswept fishing village perched on the edge of the continent, with weathered shingle houses, a lone general store, and a harbor filled with boats that looked like they'd seen better decades. The air smelled of salt and fish, and a thick, rolling fog clung to the coastline, giving the whole place a somber, mysterious atmosphere. I found a small inn to stay in, a creaky old building run by a woman who barely looked up from her crossword puzzle when I checked in. The next morning, I began my search. I started at the general store, the only place in town that seemed to be a hub of activity. I bought a coffee and casually asked the old man behind the counter if he knew anyone named Silas Blackwood. He just squinted at me, his eyes a pale, watery blue, and slowly shook his head. I tried the post office, the local diner, even the bait shop on the docks. I got the same reaction everywhere, a blank stare, a slow shake of the head, or a mumbled, "Never heard of him." It was more than just not knowing. It felt like a wall of silence. The people of Oakhaven were closed off, protective of their secrets, and I was an outsider asking questions they didn't want to answer. Days turned into a week. My initial optimism was wearing thin, replaced by a creeping sense of defeat. I'd exhausted every lead, which wasn't many to begin with. I spent my afternoons walking along the foggy beach, the cold wind whipping at my jacket, feeling like a fool. I was about to pack it all in and go home, admit that the will was a fool's errand, when I decided to try one last place. A small, dimly lit cafe called The Gull's Nest, tucked away on a side street I hadn't noticed before. I sat at a small table in the corner, nursing a cup of watery soup, and watched the few patrons come and go. The owner, a woman with kind eyes and her hair in a tight bun, refilled my coffee. On a whim, I pulled out my wallet and showed her an old, faded photograph of my grandpa I kept with me. I didn't mention Silas Blackwood. I just asked if she'd ever seen the man before. She took the photo, her brow furrowed in concentration. She studied it for a long time. "No," she said finally, her voice soft, "I don't know him." She started to hand the photo back, but then her eyes narrowed. She leaned in closer, her gaze not on my grandpa's face, but on something in the background of the picture. It was an old photo of my grandpa standing in front of his first factory. In the distant background, almost out of frame, was the corner of a building with a barely visible sign. The woman's eyes lit up with a flicker of recognition. She didn't say a word. She just grabbed a napkin and a pen, scribbled something on it, and slid it across the table to me. It was a name, Hazelwood. Then underneath it, she drew a small, crude map. It was a single road leading out of town, with a large X marked at the end. She pointed to the X, and her expression was one of pity, or maybe warning. I looked at the napkin, my heart sinking. Hazelwood. It sounded like a sanitarium, a place where people went to be forgotten. I looked back at the woman, a silent question on my face. She just gave me a sad, knowing nod. My search for a man who ruined my grandpa's life had led me to a place that felt like the end of the line. The drive down the road the cafe owner had drawn was one of the most unnerving experiences of my life. The fog grew thicker, swallowing the sound of my engine and pressing in on the car from all sides. The trees, gnarled and ancient, formed a dense canopy overhead, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching for me. After what felt like an eternity, I saw it, a set of rusted iron gates, half swallowed by overgrown ivy, with a peeling, weathered sign that read, "Hazelwood Rest Home." Beyond the gates loomed a massive, Gothic building of dark stone and grimy windows, looking more like a haunted mansion than a place of healing. It was exactly the kind of place you'd see in a horror movie, and every instinct in my body was screaming at me to turn back. But I thought of my grandpa, of the strange condition in his will, and of the millions of dollars that felt both a world away and terrifyingly close. I had to see this through. I pushed open the heavy, groaning gates and walked up the crumbling stone path to the front door. The entrance was dimly lit and smelled of disinfectant and decay. A tired-looking woman sat behind a reception desk, her face illuminated by the green glow of an old computer monitor. I explained that I was looking for a resident, a man named Silas Blackwood. I said he was a distant relative, a lie that felt clumsy and obvious on my tongue. The woman, whose name tag read Marge, didn't seem to buy it. She looked at me with deep suspicion, her eyes narrowed. She typed the name into her computer, the clacking of the keys echoing in the silent lobby. After a long moment, she nodded slowly. Yes, there was a Silas Blackwood at Hazelwood, but, she informed me, his file was flagged for privacy. He had no visitors, and his contact information was restricted. She couldn't let me see him. I felt a wave of despair wash over me. I'd come all this way, only to be stopped by a bureaucratic wall. I was about to give up, to turn and walk away and accept my failure, when I decided to try one last thing. I pulled out the photograph of my grandpa again, the one that had led me here. I didn't say anything. I just laid it on the counter in front of Marge. I pointed to my grandpa's face, and then I said his name, Arthur. I watched her face closely. Her eyes widened just for a second. A flicker of something, surprise, recognition, maybe even fear, crossed her features before she quickly composed herself. She stared at the photo for a long time, then back at me, her expression now one of grudging understanding. She sighed, a deep, weary sound, and told me to wait. She disappeared down a long, dark hallway, leaving me alone in the oppressive silence. 10 minutes later, she returned. She told me I could see him, but only for a few minutes, and only if I promised not to upset him. She led me down the hallway, past rooms filled with the faint sounds of shuffling feet and muffled coughs. She stopped at a door at the very end of the hall and knocked softly. There was no answer. She pushed the door open and gestured for me to go inside. The room was sparse and clean, but filled with a profound sadness. An old man sat in a wheelchair by the window, his back to me, staring out at the endless gray fog. He was frail, his body a mere outline under a thin blanket. This was him. This was Silas Blackwood, the man who had ruined my grandpa. I took a step forward, my mind racing, trying to rehearse the apology I was supposed to deliver. But as I got closer, my eyes fell on a small picture frame on the bedside table. It was a faded photograph of two young men, their arms slung around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera with the unbridled optimism of youth. One of them was my grandpa. The other, I knew with a certainty that made my blood run cold, was Silas Blackwood. They weren't enemies. They were best friends. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The photograph on the bedside table burned itself into my retina. My grandpa and Silas, young and strong, their faces alight with shared dreams and camaraderie. This wasn't the face of a betrayer or the face of a man betrayed. This was a picture of partnership, of brotherhood. Everything I thought I knew, the entire premise of my quest, was built on a foundation of sand. I stood there, frozen in the doorway of that sterile, sad room, the apology I had prepared dying on my lips. What was I supposed to do now? The man in the wheelchair, Silas, slowly turned his head. His eyes, cloudy with cataracts, struggled to focus on me. They were the same eyes from the photograph, but the light in them had been extinguished decades ago. I took a hesitant step into the room. I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. I just stood there, a silent intruder in this man's lonely world. He looked at me, his expression a mixture of confusion and a faint, distant curiosity. He was trying to place me, to connect my young face to a memory that was probably fading. I felt a wave of pity for him, so strong it almost brought me to my knees. This was the man my grandpa had wanted me to find? This frail, forgotten soul in a forgotten town? It made no sense. I decided to throw away the script. I wouldn't deliver a hollow apology for a crime I didn't understand. Instead, I pulled up a chair and sat down, a few feet away from him. I pointed to the photograph on the table, and then I pointed to myself, trying to convey that I was connected to the other man in the picture. His eyes followed my finger, and a flicker of recognition sparked in their depths. He looked from the photo to me and back again. His lips, thin and pale, began to tremble. A single tear rolled down his wrinkled cheek, and then, in a voice that was little more than a dry, raspy whisper, he spoke a name. It wasn't my name. It was my grandpa's name. Arthur. The sound of it hung in the air between us, a ghost from the past. And in that moment, I knew. I knew that whatever had happened between them, it hadn't been born of hatred. It had been born of something far more complicated. Over the next hour, in fits and starts, Silas told me a story. It was a story that had been locked away inside him for over 40 years, a story he had never told another living soul. He and my grandpa, Arthur, hadn't just been business partners. They had been inseparable since childhood. They had built their company from the ground up, with their own hands and their own dreams. They were more than brothers. They were two halves of a whole. Then came the fire, a catastrophic, accidental blaze that had consumed their factory in a single night. They had insurance, but due to an obscure clause they'd overlooked, the company had been denied the payout. They were ruined. Silas told me how my grandpa had been broken by the loss. He was a proud man, a man who couldn't bear the thought of being seen as a failure. He had a young family, my dad and my aunt, and he couldn't face them or the world as a bankrupt man. And so Silas told me he had made a choice, a sacrifice. He had taken the fall. He had let everyone believe that he, Silas, was the one responsible, that he had made a reckless error, that he had mismanaged the funds, that he was the one who had destroyed their dream. He became the villain in the story so that my grandpa could be the victim, a tragic hero who could walk away with his head held high and start over. It was a lie that cost Silas everything, his reputation, his friends, his future. He became an outcast, while my grandpa moved away, rebuilt his life, and never looked back. Silas finished his story, his voice barely a whisper, his gaze fixed on the gray world outside the window. He hadn't ruined my grandpa's life. He had saved it. And the price he had paid was a lifetime of solitude and shame. I left Hazelwood Rest Home in a state of profound shock. The story Silas had told me replayed in my mind, a relentless loop of revelation and regret. The fog seemed to have lifted, but the world outside looked different, the colors muted, the shapes less defined. The solid ground of my family's history had turned to quicksand, and I was sinking fast. The man I had been raised to see as a pillar of strength, my grandpa Arthur, was not just a victim of circumstance. He was the architect of a lie that had allowed him to build a new life on the ruins of his best friends. The drive back to my own town was a blur. I wasn't thinking about the inheritance anymore. The money felt tainted, a blood price for a secret that should have never been kept. I didn't go home. I drove straight to my dad's house. I found him in his workshop, surrounded by the tools and the scent of sawdust that had been a constant throughout my childhood. He was working on a small wooden birdhouse, his hands moving with the practiced ease of a man who found comfort in creation. I didn't say hello. I just walked in and laid the photograph of my grandpa and Silas on his workbench. I told him everything. I told him about the will, about Oakhaven, about Hazelwood, and about the story Silas had shared with me. I spoke in a calm, even voice, laying out the facts one by one, watching his face for a reaction. At first, he just stared at the photo, his expression unreadable. He denied it, of course. He said Silas was an old man, his mind probably gone, making up stories. But I pressed on. I told him about the fire, the insurance, the sacrifice. I saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes. I described the look on Silas's face when he said my grandpa's name, a look of such deep, abiding love and sorrow that it couldn't be faked. And that's when my dad's composure finally broke. He sank onto a nearby stool, his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. He knew. He had known all along. He told me that my grandpa had confessed the truth to him a few years before he died, burdened by the weight of his guilt. He had made my dad promise not to tell anyone, to let the family legend of the betrayal stand. He said it was to protect the family's image, to protect my grandpa's legacy. But I knew the real reason. It was to protect my grandpa's pride, even in death. My dad then told me the final piece of the puzzle. He said that in his last years, my grandpa had been consumed by his guilt. He would talk about Silas constantly, wondering where he was, if he was okay. He was too proud, too ashamed to reach out himself. So he had concocted the bizarre condition in his will. It wasn't a test. It wasn't a demand for an apology. It was a cry for help. It was the only way he knew to ensure that someone from his family would finally find Silas. Not to ask for forgiveness, but to offer it. The apology wasn't for Silas's benefit. It was for my grandpa's. It was a way for him to say, "I'm sorry," from beyond the grave. I left my dad's workshop with a new sense of purpose. The mission was no longer about fulfilling a condition to get an inheritance. It was about completing a circle, about righting a decades-old wrong. I went back to the lawyer's office and told him I had found Silas Blackwood. Mr. Henderson nodded, as if he'd been expecting it all along. He opened a safe and handed me a sealed envelope. "Your grandfather left this for you," he said. "He instructed me to give it to you only after you had found Mr. Blackwood." I took the envelope, my hand steady for the first time in weeks. I knew what I had to do. I got back in my car and started the long drive back to Oakhaven, back to Hazelwood, back to the man who had sacrificed everything for the sake of a friendship. The return trip to Oakhaven felt different. The oppressive fog was gone, replaced by a brilliant, clear sky. The gnarled trees seemed less menacing, more like wise old sentinels guarding a long-held secret. This time, I wasn't a detective or a treasure hunter. I was a messenger, a conduit for a truth that had been buried for too long. I walked into Hazelwood with a sense of calm resolve. Marge, the receptionist, just nodded at me, her expression soft with understanding, and let me pass. I walked down the long, quiet hallway to Silas's room, the sealed letter from my grandpa feeling like a lead weight in my pocket. I found him in the same spot by the window, but he seemed a little more alert today. He turned as I entered, and a faint smile touched his lips. He remembered me. I pulled up the same chair as before and sat down. I didn't waste any time with pleasantries. I told him that I knew everything. I told him that my dad had confirmed the story and that my grandpa had spent his final years filled with regret for the lie he had lived and the friendship he had broken. I saw the tears well up in Silas's eyes again, but this time they weren't tears of sorrow. They were tears of release. Then I carefully opened the sealed envelope from my grandpa. The paper was brittle, the handwriting shaky. I began to read the letter aloud. It was a confession, a eulogy, and a love letter all in one. My grandpa wrote about the fire, about his shame, and about his cowardice. He wrote about the pride that had kept him silent for 40 years, a pride that had cost him his best friend. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He knew he didn't deserve it. Instead, he thanked Silas. He thanked him for the sacrifice, for the gift of a new life, for the friendship that had been the true cornerstone of his existence. He wrote about how he had watched his own son, and then his grandson grow up, and how a part of him had always ached for Silas to be there, to be their uncle. The letter ended with a simple, powerful sentence. "You were the better man, my friend. You always were." As I finished reading, a profound silence filled the room. Silas was looking at me, but his eyes were seeing something else, some other time and place. He reached out a trembling hand and I took it. His grip was surprisingly strong. He squeezed my hand, and in that single gesture, a lifetime of pain and resentment seemed to dissolve. He was forgiving my grandpa, and in doing so, he was finally forgiving himself. I stayed with him for a while longer, not saying anything, just sharing the quiet peace that had finally settled over the room. I left Hazelwood for the last time with the letter tucked back in my pocket. I called Mr. Henderson and told him the condition had been fulfilled. The inheritance was mine. The millions of dollars, the estate, the stocks and bonds, they were all legally mine. But as I drove away from Oakhaven, I knew that the real inheritance had nothing to do with money. It was the truth. It was the understanding that a person's legacy isn't built on their successes, but on how they face their failures. I decided that day how I would use the money. A large portion would go to ensure Silas lived out the rest of his days in comfort, receiving the best care possible. The rest I would use to establish a foundation in the names of Arthur and Silas, a foundation dedicated to helping small business owners who had suffered catastrophic losses, a testament to a dream that was born in friendship and ended in sacrifice. My grandpa's will had a bizarre condition, but it led me to a truth far more valuable than any fortune. It led me to the story of two men and the unbreakable bond that defined their lives, and that was a legacy worth more than all the money in the world.